A report into the former Parktown Boys High, a water polo coach accused of sexual assault, is being released tonight. It was first made available to parents and pupils. The former coach has pleaded guilty to 144 charges. Let's take you live to that briefing. We're inside the room where we're told parents and officials of the Department of Housing have met tonight, and they're taking them through this report. Let's listen in.
That law firm, for the context which they were referring to, which made them come to the belief that that such actions were not racist, and that was not supplied. Fask and Martineau found that the SGB of the school had only been appointed in around April 2018, and thus it was too early to determine whether the SGB is ineffective. We agreed with that finding. At the time we convinced our, they found that the SGB had only been in office for approximately 3 months, and that since the report had only come out in late February, that it was not, it could not be laid at their door as to the efficacy of their functioning. In relation to the SMT informed that law firm that they'd taken steps to deal with various complaints that had been brought to their attention. However, the concerned group of parents found that this was not the case. Fask and Martineau recommended a detailed audit in that regard. We support that finding. Fask and Martineau recommended that the GDE and the school engage with the foundation who owns the hostel in an attempt to ensure closure of the bar, and that there be liaison in relation to that. We agree with that finding, and that is a conversation that should take place. But we also feel that there needs to be a complete designation and specification of roles between the hostel and the school, and each of the persons associated with those institutions. The law firm, as stated, found that there should be more engagement between GDE officials and the school. We support that finding. The law firm recommended that there be compliance with schools' policies. We obviously support that, and that they should be revisited in certain cases. We support that too. And also that the recruitment process of the school in terms of its educators and staff should be reviewed. We support that finding. Then there were other areas in which we either disagreed with or elaborated on the findings of that law firm. That law firm found that the initiation practices which took place at the grade 8 camp were historical, as the camp was discontinued in 2017, and that no information was provided by the interviewed learners to confirm that initiation practices were ongoing. Based on this, the law firm concluded that such initiation practices do not take place at the school. We disagree with that finding. We found that evidence was presented in terms of, in particular, an educator, Educator D, condoning and encouraging initiation practices on sports tours, and we've recommended that disciplinary action be launched. That was as a result of a recording which we listened to, in which that educator is specifically on tape, having made those statements. So there's no dispute about that, ladies and gentlemen. Then, in terms of the initiation that took place in 2017 at the camp, it needs to be stated that assault is a common law offense. Okay? And assault of any form does not prescribe, and it cannot be described as historical, even if it took place in the past. And certain of their allegations that were, and evidence that was produced to us, confirm, or at least are a strong prima facie case, that such assaults did take place, and as such, they can never be regarded as historical. In relation to the assault that took place on the water polo tour, we've listened to the recording of that, we've watched the video, we saw what took place. it's not pleasant. That's where a child was lashed. We find that the disciplinary process that was conducted in respect of those responsible gave or imposed an inappropriately light sentence. One needs to acknowledge that, unfortunately, because this is a proud and great school, that since 2009, initiation practices involving some quite severe assaults have taken place, and that there have been allegations of severe initiation taking place at various camps and on various occasions and in various sporting teams over the years. And particularly since the events of the Colin Rex incidents surfaced when they did in the last year or two, issues of any violence towards any children should have been, we find, strenuously and rigorously addressed in order to send the right message. And we find that the SGB did not impose a correct sentence in that case. We do note that the acting headmaster, Mr. Stipple, appealed that and requested that a more severe sentence be imposed, but nonetheless we feel that that was dealt with as being too light. We deal with the issues of what is deemed as historical by the previous law firm, and we disagree. In relation to the allegation of, and it's, I quote the heading that was in the previous law firm's report, not ours, quote, bullying of learners by boarding masters and touching of learners inappropriately, including forcing juniors to give seniors blowjobs. Martineau found that they specifically addressed those regarding the behavior of a particular educator F, and they found in relation to that allegation that the allegation was historical and could not be confirmed by interviewed parents and learners. We disagree with it being classified as historical for the reasons that I've stated. And then in relation to educator F, in relation to the allegations of assault of a particular learner, that law firm, Vasco Martineau, found merit to those, and that person is the subject of a disciplinary hearing, which we agree with. We will go into this in more detail. In relation to children using drugs at school, again, that law firm's heading, they found there was no evidence of learners using drugs at the school, and that no educators were aware of any incidents of this nature. We requested a list of all drug-related misdemeanors or incidents at the school over the last 5 years, and we found that in every year there were certain incidents, generally averaging about 5, sometimes more, sometimes less. But we have to state that we are not narcotics experts, so we are not in a position as lawyers to say above this amount qualifies as a drug problem or below this amount doesn't. What we do know is that drugs are a societal problem, and they are a problem at most schools in the country, and it doesn't necessarily appear to us that the number of those incidents are any greater than you would find at any other school if you were to make inquiries. It does not appear to us that it indicates that there's a problem of drugs at the school. It should be noted that we also inquired into what measures were taken in terms of testing and use of sniffer dogs and counselling and rehabilitation, and we found that the efforts that had been taken by the school in that regard were commendable and were sufficient. In relation to the issue of racist remarks, I think we've dealt with that. Learners forced to shave with the same razor blade. The previous law firm's reports found that there was no evidence to support this allegation. We found that, in fact, there was evidence to support it, and pretty strong evidence. and we've recommended that this practice should stop. Obviously, for health reasons, you know, kids going through, youngsters going through, adolescence have different issues with their skins and so on, and it's just not appropriate in the circumstances. It's also an unusual, if not cruel, punishment to be made to do it during school hours. The allegation of strippers being brought into the school during night parties. The previous law firm found that despite the boarding directors, Mr. Bossett and Ms. Bossett, alleging that educator D had collected money in order to bring a strip into the school, there was no further evidence or information related to this event and that it was historical. We find that there is sufficient evidence to indicate that educator did order a stripper to come to the school on the night in question, and that there are witnesses to this event. And we disagree with that finding, and that we believe that there's a prima facie case that exists in relation to that educator. Possibility of learners committing suicide. The previous law firm found there was no evidence to support this allegation, and thus it is uncorroborated. We made some inquiries. We found that there was one learner who had committed suicide. We went through the psychologist's reports in relation to that learner. It was clear from the psychologist's reports, and we quote from it extensively in the main report, that the learner had been the subject of assault at the school when he was a learner here, and that had, in the view of the psychologist, significantly contributed to that person taking his own life. We were also informed that there are 33 boys currently receiving counselling and 6 on suicide watch. So we, in fact, disagree with that finding. And then there were a number of allegations against certain educators, and we'll go into those in due course, but we disagree with certain of the findings of the previous law firm. There was an allegation in relation to a disciplinary process of a particular learner, and that there was inadequate notice and representation in relation to that learner for the disciplinary process, and we find that there was merit in that allegation. The issue of the hostel, we were concerned that a view was expressed by certain of the persons at a senior level in the school that, in a sense, what happened at the hostel was the kind of hostel's problem and not the school's problem. And that because it was owned and run by the foundation, and they employed their own employees to take care of the hostel, that it was not the obligation of the school. Our finding is that, and we view that with concern, because certain of the persons employed in the hostel were also employed in roles in the school, whether it's in a sporting capacity or an educational capacity, and as such, the school is responsible for their conduct. De facto and in law, still has committed misconduct and brought the name of the school into disrepute at best. If it's serious misconduct, other charges should follow. So what we say is, and we recommend, that there needs to be a comprehensive review of the way in which the hostel is governed, its corporate governance, and its relationship with the school. And let me also just be clear here, and it's also reinforced significantly by Luke Lamprecht's reports to the school, who was the consultant hired by the school after the Rex incidents, that the majority of incidents that are referred to in this report took place at the hostel. There are other incidents which didn't take place at the hostel, very sadly and regrettably. And we've mentioned some of those, and there are others that are subject to the Rex case which didn't take place at the hostel. But the fact of the matter is that the majority of these reports took place at the hostel. And when we interviewed learners who were not from the hostel, but from that RCL group, their view, and in fairness I have to state it, was that actually there's not much of a code of silence and initiation hardly takes place. It was also the view of certain members of the disgruntled parents. And they said they hadn't had this experience, and that their experience of the school was not that, in terms of what was portrayed in the newspapers or which had been the subject of these allegations. And I'll come to this later, but the simple reason for that, and Lamprecht finds it in both his reports, is that the majority of these abuses took place in the hostel. It doesn't exempt the other actions that took place outside the hostel, but it was a focus of many of these activities, and we find that. So, in relation to initiation, we find that the culture of initiation still exists, and that more needs to be done to ensure that it is completely eradicated. At the same time, we also found that the school has taken some commendable steps. They've installed cameras, they've installed a Guardian app, and a whole range of other measures. And these things are hard to stamp out. And it takes many forms, whether it's in the form of humiliation or extreme physical abuse, such as occurred at the 2017 camp. And these issues are challenges which every school grapples with and faces, and they increase and decrease in intensity. But it would appear that this has become a generational practice at Parktown Boys, and I'll give you my reasons for that later.
Peter Harris there of H&M Attorneys, and he's taking the learners and education officials through the report. This is the second report to be compiled into what has been happening, at least beyond the corridors of Parktown Boys High School. Many of you would have seen the case that is currently before court, the trial, a sexual assault case there taking place. But certainly the details of this report absolutely devastating, especially in comparison to the first report, which had dismissed a lot of the issues which Harris has been raising now. Slindelo Masikani is there for us, and I imagine that many of the parents at Parktown Boys High School will be demanding answers tonight around the true safety of their children, especially those who are in the boarding school at that particular school, which is where the bulk of these abuses, as we've heard tonight, have been taking place. Those findings are certainly devastating, even for the learners who have been involved, and certainly many of them would need a lot of help going forward. But